15 minutes for discussion. Questions for Anna? Questions for any of our speakers? Oh, the rules are changing. The rules are changing during the game. Okay. Okay, first question.
I was wondering if you could use the app also when there are no plans. I was inspired by the term crowdsourced urbanism. The app is for when there are plans in development or ideas for plans, so you enter an area. But you could also use the app for haphazardly people expressing their concern about their environment or ideas about amelioration of the urban tissue.
Yes, of course, it could be used for that, but the original idea was to integrate ongoing plans because different areas of the city are very different and have very different needs. So maybe for one area you can allow that the citizen says, I want the street to be pedestrian and I want it to be 3 meters wide, or I want it to be 20 meters wide, and it could work for that area, but maybe it cannot work for another area. So we were starting with the ongoing plans because we think that the things that you can edit are not completely free. So you have to make some limits for this editing. But yes, of course, when there's nothing going on, you always can comment or share your concern about a lack of that part of the city or whatever.
But it's an interesting concept. Who are our experts here? Are there similar systems where people are essentially starting with a blank map and we're allowing citizens to go wild from zero, or do we normally start from a straw man and then move forward?
Well, there's an example of Juan Carlos Vargas Moreno's doctoral thesis that's in my book, and the difficulty that I foresee and the advantages that I foresee. The advantages are commenting on something that you see. That's the easy part. The hard part is what happens if there are conflicting views and how do you decide? The other hard part is some things are short-term and immediate and visual, some things are long-term and not visual. For example, how would you decide where to put a sewer system or a road system or a general hospital? Somebody wants the street wider, but then you need garbage trucks, ambulances, and emergencies. And at some point, you have to confront the problem that's the difficult problem, and that is how to actually decide among conflicts. Which two deans get the one new building in your campus when they both want it? The other issue is, what do you mean by participatory? At a certain scale, like the scale of the Netherlands, you have several million people, but you also have an electoral government. And the question is, do the people who use the word participatory include the government as participants? All right? And at different scales, different people have legitimacy as participants. At the local scale, everybody has legitimacy. Nobody tells me what kind of sheets I put on my bed or what I have for dinner. But if we have to decide whether there's going to be a new airport in the region of Amsterdam, the question is, who are the participants? Now, there are local people, regional people, watershed people, government people. And they each have different views, different perspectives, different policies. And if you're focusing on the local, participation is easy. If you're focusing on the national, it's really, really hard. Well, the questions that you have to ask is, how scalable are the approaches? Your process is very, very appropriate for walking down the street. Is it appropriate for locating a new airport in the north of Spain? Well, those are the kind of questions that you really have to think through, and that we all have to think through.
Very interesting, thanks.
Yeah, just to add to that, there was an interesting example of a participatory approach to a congestion charging scheme in the UK in Greater Manchester, so the Manchester City region. And it was a referendum. We don't have these very often in the UK. And the only people who could vote in the referendum were citizens of the city region, the 10 local authorities. I work in Manchester, but I don't live in that city. I couldn't vote, and lots of people who work in the central area had no vote, but yet were the people who were commuting in and out. Yeah, yes. So it's, scale and how, and similar work we did sort of nearly 15 years ago on nuclear waste disposal and an online GIS tool. If it's online, how do you control who has access and who does not? And actually, certainly in the UK, people in the Republic of Ireland were very against our nuclear waste disposal site on the west coast of England, because the pollution flumes potentially run across into the Republic of Ireland. I know Bono's wife was apparently a big campaigner against all of this. So the real problems around, particularly when we're talking everything, just assume that everything is online. How do you control for that? And it's not been solved, for 15 years.
Further comments on that, or on any of the speakers' talks?
Just to pick up on a point that Richard made during his talk, he said there's the problem of reaching the hard-to-reach people. And I guess in cities, it's those people who are hard to reach that are also where the costs are. So I'd be interested in people's thoughts around how we use design thinking to reach the hard to reach, which is where the real problems are that are worth solving, if you like.
So you're talking about hard to reach people, for example, because they're not carrying smartphones.
Well, yeah, let's take an aging population. Sorry. Let's take the aging population across Europe. They're not carrying smartphones in general. They don't always have access to technology. And yet, despite all that, they're probably they're dying of loneliness, and that's a statistic in Britain. So how do we reach them and extend their well-being and cut the costs down of hospital beds being utilised by those people, for example? A real problem.
Yeah, an interesting one too, because normally smart cities focus on things like energy consumption. That's what the companies are going after, but they don't often look at the social side. Maybe that's not so interesting for them.
Apart from the fact that some of the work we've done are not to put people off their lunch, there are things called smart toilets that they can put in people's homes that can detect, and in the UK, and it can do a test on the urine in the water and can remotely send the information to the doctor so they can intervene before the patient even realises they might have a problem. But yes, I mean, the hard-to-reach groups, it's often city governments spend the most money on those citizens who have least access and educational attainment around sort of the parts of cities where we have to do most of our work are often the most deprived areas, and they're exactly the citizens that have least access to the technology and have the lowest levels of educational attainment, so struggle to engage in these kind of things.
Wasn't there talk also about sensors for detecting influenza in our phones, so that we're all carrying a sensor at all times?
Joseph was asked a very interesting question about rural areas. I don't remember who asked it. The World Bank in 2009 revised all of its planning directives and decided to not accept anymore the distinction between urban and rural, and to basically focus its main investment programs on watersheds, on river basins. And they made the argument that if you just define the two as urban and rural, you don't understand the relationship of air, water, and food on the city. And so the answer to the question that was asked is you damn well have to understand agriculture and forestry at the same time you understand bus systems and sewer systems and transportation systems. And it raises a very interesting question. How many of us interested in geodesign are interested in a limited problem solved deeply, or a broad problem solved strategically? And do you do the same thing when you're dealing with a specific problem, like let's invent a toilet that can tell you whether you've got diabetes, or whether you're trying to maintain the water supply and the air of Beijing in the next 50 years? Those are very different problems. They're design problems. They're not done the same way. And the question that I have way in the back of my mind is, how do we parse scale, size, and content into groups? Because if you really think that somebody in geodesign can do any geodesign, you're crazy. The question then is, how many parses do we have? How many types? How many styles? How many ways? And who's going to learn them all? So in the end, it's going to be, what's the problem? What has to be solved? How much resources do you have? And now you have to figure out how to do it. I think that's the question.
And it affects directly the manner in which we would teach these things as well. Our first two speakers come from interdisciplinary programs. One at the undergraduate level, well, both, and then another the doctoral program. Not housed in any one particular field, so they're not, I suppose, not drilling down into only one particular topic, but covering a wider area. Others, I guess, they don't address geodesign in that manner. They're heavy on architecture, heavy on something, and they drill down. Other opinions on that? Is that an interesting distinction? A couple different ways, at least, that we might look at geodesign at the universities?
Just to pick up on Carl's point, I think the title "Smart Cities" is obviously appealing, but because half the world's population now live in urban areas. But given what Carl was saying, those cities are fed by rural communities, and is it misleading to use the term "smart cities"? Should we not really be talking about smart communities? And by smart, we're talking about we're smart if we can sustain in the economic, social, and environmental sense ourselves going into the future. That would be my definition of smart. And smart technology would be smart if it helps us in the right instances to achieve that.
It was mentioned at the outset this morning that the smart city concept in many respects comes from the IBMs and the big corporations that are essentially trying to convince you that smart means sensors and smart means data integration. A lot of money. You need to pour money on it to create a smart city. Yeah, but what about the other definition? What about the definition of putting in bike paths and getting rid of the cars in the city, for example? So I guess the companies don't make so much money doing it that way.
The word smart is like the word sustainable was sort of 20 years ago. So it's stuck on front of everything.
Yeah. But I think it's even stronger because it's tied to technology.
But I think I didn't have time, but the reason I like the Project for Public Places, Public Spaces program and their website and their web materials and so forth is because they seem very focused on empowering people to sort of build from the bottom up. Now, it doesn't get at Carl's problem that maybe the most fertile place for solutions is in some sort of middle zone, somewhere between the local and the global, or the local and the regional. But I think that the focus needs to be on people, and for me, people involves all the different people we've talked about, the experts, the government, because all of these people have to get in the mix if you're going to accomplish real change. But many times, change can come at a relatively cheap cost, but it needs broad participation. Otherwise, you build outcomes for the wrong groups of people.
And it's tied directly to gamification. Gamification is not creating games. Gamification is providing incentives to change behavior. And some of them are very, very simple. And some of them are much more elaborate and more electronic. But we've heard gamification now as a sort of common theme many times now, already this morning. Interesting how it's creeping into our discussions. Carl's not sure.
I think the person who designs the game has enormous power in that, and I'm not convinced. I think having people invent the game is a better strategy, and that's been tried several times. I think the issue of smartness, if you really knew what you wanted to do, and you really knew how to judge whether you've done it, you ought to have a search for the least data, not the biggest data. And I've said this yesterday in this presentation that I made. And you want the cheapest, easiest, fastest things. Those were the three keys on the last slide that John showed, which he didn't talk about. You want less complexity, less data, largely to increase understanding, because there's a trade-off between complexity and understanding. And if action is the objective, understanding is more important than complexity. And the move on complex cities and big data, I think, is a red herring. I think it's just basically avoiding the question of how do we make the right decisions. Now, technology has a huge role in that, but it's not the end. Being a smart city, you could start great wars if you're a start. It doesn't mean you're doing good.
Does technology simplify anything? Does it simplify anything? I mean, in practical terms, are we seeing technology simplify things?
No, I've seen people simplify things, but I've never seen technology simplify.
Is there anyone out there in the universities teaching young people how to simplify?
Yeah.
So where's that? Well, okay. Generalizing. What context?
Look, let me guide you to something. I'm going to give a talk tomorrow on a project that had to be done in 3 days. It's a real serious project, and it had to be done with a systems approach. And the question of where the designs came from and how they were made is the central question that we ought to be asking after I presented. And my role was to tell a group of people who knew more about the subject matter than me what level of complexity and how they could work to get where they wanted to go in 3 days. And I had a huge number of choices because I was working with people I've worked with for 15 years. And this is a project that has relatively highly succeeded because it was understandable. Now, it was not participatory in the way some of you are thinking, but it was participatory in the case that the people who were professionals came from the areas that we came from. And I'll show that project with its underbelly exposed. I'll tell you what didn't work and I'll tell you what did work. But the remarkable thing is that it's very similar to a project that I did 50 years ago in GIS. But that project took 2 years, okay? And it took millions of dollars. And this took almost no cost, and it was done in 3 days, which is very, very interesting.
But let me insist. Who's teaching young people to simplify? Is that something which happens in design school? I know more about geography and about information systems, and it doesn't happen there.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I give an exercise to my students, past students, because I haven't done this for about 5 years. It's called the governor in the taxi cab. The governor of Massachusetts calls you. You're designing a region in Massachusetts. He says, meet me in my office. I'm going to Logan Airport. I've got 5 minutes. Tell me what you want. And I'll either say no or I'll say yes. And then I have an egg timer. And I turn the egg timer over, and if a student can't, I do this with my doctoral students. If a doctoral student or a team of students can't say what they need to tell me in 3 or 4 minutes, I say, thank you, I'm gone. And I make them say, get to it. I also, as a norm, I make my doctoral students tell me what their final thesis product will be before they're allowed to begin. What is it going to be? I make my master's students design their final presentation before they begin their project. So I say, this is going to be in this room. It's got 20 meters of space. You've got 15 students. Each student is not worth more than 1 meter of space. What's going to be on your drawing? And I don't want to see your preliminary. I only want to see the final product. You'll have the rest on a jump drive somewhere. So the answer is yes. And the reason is attention span is shrinking. And our Spanish colleague made a derogatory comment about long paper reports. Well, how long is derogatory? To her, it was from 150 pages down to 40. Well, how about 2 minutes? And I had, allow me my last comment, then I have to shut up because Tess is getting impatient. I had a colleague who's no longer alive, a very, very wise professor. And he said, you can't hurry time. And what he was talking about is the time it takes to understand, not to see, but to understand. And I'm old, you know. I'm probably the only one in this room who doesn't have a smartphone. I don't. Mine is an old thing. But it takes time for these citizens to understand. And looking at it doesn't mean they understand. Right? Don't believe for a minute that visualization equals understanding. Constable, the great painter of complex systems, clouds, he said, it's not I see, therefore I understand. When he painted clouds, he said, I understand, therefore I see. And that takes time. That's why we shouldn't trust people under 40.
Not to be provocative at all. What about graphic designers? They design things so that they'll be simplified, but are they guareteeing that you'll understand, or are they just trying to, or are they just trying, well, or are they just trying to convey a message?
If you're
Conveying.
a professor, you should realize that if you don't understand it, it's not your fault. It's their fault. And that's a very famous theorem of communications that was designed in the 50s. And it basically says there's a message, a medium, and a meaning. There's a sender, a medium, and a receiver. And the question is, if you don't understand, whose problem is it? And in most places that I work, it's the sender's problem that's wrong, not the receiver.
Thank you. It's difficult moving the microphone around all the time. Other comments? Final comments? I'm not keeping track of time now, but I suppose we are now finally getting close to lunch.
Sorry, just on your question of who's using graphic designers, we run a challenge program at Ordnance Survey where we take big problems like how can Britain feed itself sustainably. We get a lot of different stakeholders together who post up problems, and then we put those problems out for others to come back with ideas to solve them. And the best of those we invite into a weekend 2-day camp, working very closely with interactive designers, service designers, graphic designers. And we work with them to turn that idea of theirs into a venture that can sustain itself as a means of solving the problem. We call it Geospatial.org.uk. And we found working with designers and design thinking really, really powerful because they get to the nub of the problem, they uncover what you thought was a problem, and at the end of the camp, they're pitching in 2 minutes, this is a problem, this is my solution, and importantly, this is the business model that's going to sustain the solution, and can I have some funding? So we funded about £500,000 worth of new ideas through that methodology, working with others, and we're learning all the time off it for ourselves as well.
And I think we're seeing some really interesting cartographic products coming out of really innovative small groups that don't have all the baggage of sort of being topographers, let's say, and the need to represent every little item on the earth at centimeter resolution just because. They come from a business standpoint, and the question is to tell a story, to provide a message. So I just throw that out there. I think the graphic designers are looking at that. And then, of course, there are elevator pitches, right? Business people simplify, right? And it's not always honest, but they focus on a message, getting rid of a lot of the extraneous details to try to convince people. Oftentimes, they don't have the time to roll out the 100-page document. They have, they have to ride up the elevator with Bill Gates. Okay, thank you very much. It's been interesting. Of course, we never have enough time to continue good discussions, but anyway, I think we had a good start. And so please join me one final time in thanking our 5 speakers, and then lunch is waiting.
The lunch is ready in the tent outside, and there is coffee as well.